Hi, this is Paul Tyler, and welcome to another episode of the Reimagine podcast. Laura, good to see you today.
It's great to be back, Paul.
And who do we have with us today on our show as a guest?
Sure. So we have Jon Cooper, the co-founder and CEO of Life.io, joining us on the podcast today. And he may be a familiar name for those of you who have tuned into the Reimagining Retirement Forum series, because Jon had joined us as a panelist on Forum 2. So Jon, thanks so much for being with us here today. And for the benefit of the listeners, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that the company is doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, Laura, thanks for having me. So Lifeio is one of the early insurtechs, and we were really early to market to think about the relationship between insurance companies and the end policyholder. So to put that into context, I'll give you a quick story. Remember going to my first industry event in 2015 at Limera, and I told people what we were doing. I said, yeah, we're helping build a relationship between customers and carriers. And I was almost laughed out of the room. It was, why would you do that? That's the job of the advisor. So fast forward, 5, 6 years, here we are, sort of the dawn of a era where carriers, advisors, customers all work really closely together through digital.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting how fast the industry has moved, right? Like, really, you don't have an engagement platform for your customers. I mean, I think some of the expectations people have today for carriers, Jon. I mean, is that fair?
All of a sudden, it was funny. I felt this way as a startup where we were a new business, and then all of a sudden we were an old business. We were never sort of a medium business. And the same thing seems to happen with innovation. It's, you don't have it, and then all of a sudden it's, why don't you have it yet?
Yeah, it really is now. And you said you were ahead of the curve. You truly are ahead of the curve. A lot of the companies in our program, I described as somewhere between seed, maybe Series A. Looking for that product market fit. Okay, you got it. You built it. You went out. You capitalized it, and you actually. You're still in it, but you actually had a successful exit as an acquisition from SE2. So, do you consider yourself to be a mature insurtech at this point?
So we call ourselves a quote unquote established startup. And the way we frame that is you get the benefits of a startup where you've got a team of very creative, nimble, hungry people, but without some of the risk factors that you associate with startups. We found product market fit. We've done it long enough time that we figured out the nuances, and we're well funded, well backed by large corporate, strategic, and private equity.
Yeah. So tell us your backstory. And we actually discovered some kind of interesting connections ourselves. My daughter actually worked at the same consulting firm, I guess, Jon, that you did. But to take us back in time, like, how did you get to where you were? And I'm also real curious to understand how did you get so far ahead of everyone in this space?
It's funny. I was on a radio show recently, and it was this very strange thing where they basically take founders, and you think you're just going to talk about your business, but they almost like try to psychoanalyze you in front of a bunch of people. They try to understand like what makes you take this risk and what made you go down this path. So if what I learned about myself in this process is that I kind of come from a family of entrepreneurs. I didn't realize this because my mom's a doctor, my dad's a lawyer, but they're really sort of self-starters. So my mom, I went to school that my mom founded. I was like one of three kids in like the back of a church in a trailer and an international school in the South. And all throughout my life, things were sort of being built around me. So, my dad starting his own law practice, my mom starting her own medical practice, and starting the school I went to. So out of college, I thought I wanted to do stuff in international relations, having gone to international school, studied international relations, and I joined a think tank and focused on international policy. And, was so excited, be at the heart of power in DC, and quickly became very sort of disenchanted by the whole experience, where just seeing the sausage being made was an ugly process. And meanwhile, college I went to had a big business school. I went to UPenn where they have Wharton, and all these kids were going off to do things in business. I thought, oh, maybe they're onto something. So went into consulting, and that's where I really started to learn about what's happening in the insurance industry, healthcare, But from the get-go, I sort of said, look, if I'm going to be in business, I want to really be building something, starting things, and hopefully being a change agent. And serendipitously, we ended up in this space where my best friend from college and I started the business. Our original concept was so different from what we're doing today. The whole initial idea was around securitizing healthcare and rewarding people through financial instruments for leading a healthy life. And then one thing led to another, and we ended up with a large multinational carrier as a pilot client. And that's where we realized that our initial idea was just too complicated. But meanwhile, this carrier had, they had about 50 different investment insurance products, P&C products, life products, and yet most of their clients only had one. And it seemed to us this big opportunity of like, why doesn't each client have 5 products? Why don't they go back to this carrier for everything they need? And that's sort of where the business evolved and turned into what it is now, about building that relationship between carriers, their clients, and then nurturing it so you can cross-sell, improve retention, and really, help advisors sell more.
So during the pandemic, you talk about the relationship, and a lot of what you're doing is clearly in the virtual space. We've seen a lot of people had to transition from face-to-face interaction to computer interaction. With all the work that you're doing, do you have, a piece of advice to give someone on the other end here saying like, how can I possibly do this? Because I would think for the foreseeable future, we're going to be behind Zoom.
It's been interesting. Over the past, one of the blessings and I guess curses of being early is, you build the technology for the moment. So we had built our technology when we went to market in 2015. And if you look at what was popular in 2015 to a 2021 customer experience, it feels dated. That's not a very long time, but that is it's a pretty long window when it comes to technology, just the interfaces, the attention to UI, UX. Fortunately, the timing of the SE2 and Eldridge investments and so on, it allowed us last year, or 2019 really, to rebuild the whole experience around the platform. And it couldn't have happened at a better time because, in spite of everything that's terrible that's happened with COVID, it's moved everyone to digital. But, so often, especially in the insurance industry, people think about just digitizing transactions and digitizing the process that they're used to doing. But now you have to think so much more carefully about the actual experience, the digital experience that people are going to go through, and count every click, count every screen, count every friction point. And that's such a subtle learning that I think, businesses have to shift to. But it's really important. And in my opinion, it can be the deciding factor between a very successful digital application and one that sort of putters, installs, and dies.
Yeah, well, maybe talk a little bit more about the solution you're delivering. So, our company really well. We're actually, we've got a strategic partnership or relationship going with at this point with SE2. What are the opportunities for a company like us? We're not a huge company. We're not a small one. We're someplace in between. We've got a lot of different customer, policyholder blocks. Some of these people, a lot of these people that bought policies from, carriers that had nothing. Nassau was nowhere in any of the policyholder documents at that point. Yet they've got a relationship with us. What are the opportunities? And by the way, I'm asking this question because I think there are a lot of carriers out there in our, in our situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable. Some of the stats we see, the typical policyholder will interact with their carrier 2 times a year, and that typically is very transactional. It's a privacy notice and an invoice, and it's not the most warm and fuzzy interactions, and yet think about all the different. Well, think about a few things. One, the cost of acquisition. It's not cheap to acquire a customer in the life and annuity business. It's quite expensive. So the economies you get if you can cross-sell, upsell, and improve persistency from a pure financial standpoint, are quite profitable. So that's one aspect that ends up being really critical to the industry. And we've seen carriers sort of, I used to hear carriers say, oh, our persistency is great. It's 95%. And that is great. But, another 2% is typically in the neighborhood of several $1,000,000 of profit, not just premium, but profits to the bottom line each year. Now, how do you foster that relationship? That's really where a company like Lifeio comes into place. And what we found is that consumers really do want to hear from their carrier. And a lot of carrier, one of the things we used to hear in 2015 that was somewhat jaw-dropping was, quote, I don't want to contact them because they might realize that they're paying this premium and they might want to stop paying, they might lapse.
Oh yeah. Let sleeping dogs lie. Just,
yeah.
They paid it, stay it, don't remind them about it. So I have to resell a policy to them.
Yeah. And that's what we used to hear. Now we've seen the industry move sharply away from that to recognizing that having a relationship with their customer is valuable. And there's tons of data that we have to prove it, where it's, better net promoter score, better persistency rates, cross-sell rates, and so on. Now, the way we found to be really effective to engage people is not around products per se. In fact, with one of our clients, we did a head-to-head test where we did a pure product marketing push, where we promoted different products they had, scheduled an appointment with an advisor to learn about our new blah, blah, blah product. And then the B test was a much softer engagement-based relationship building, where it's, let me help you build a budget. Let me help you improve your health. Let me educate you about hypertension, and so on. Those types of things where our platform comes into play. What we saw is that on the front end, 18 times more people open their email and click through to engage versus the hard push. And then it led to 28 times higher lead conversion rates, where we were able to bring in the lead and farm it off to an advisor. So, the industry is ripe with opportunities like that, where, I think one of the most undervalued assets insurance companies have is their existing customer base, where if they could tap into it, improve persistency and cross-sell, there's a huge opportunity.
It's funny. I'm one of those people who I don't like to talk to my carrier, and when I do, I try to usually get them to give me a better price. So,
that's so surprising, Laura.
It's like, well, knock on wood, you don't usually have a reason to contact them, but when you do, what can you do for me lately? So, through the discussion, you talked a little bit about, high expectations. People have high expectations, click-throughs. How easy is it going to be for me? How can you keep me engaged? What are you guys doing to make sure the product doesn't become stale as everything continues to progress, and at some speeds, like faster than it was even a year ago?
That's such a good point. It's and that's where it gets back to the point earlier about what was exciting in 2015 had grown old and stale. Like, it was all the rage, the idea that you could connect your wearables and do step competitions. Now, everything is connected to how many steps I do. My phone, my watch, it's grown old and tired. And so that's, really an area that we've invested heavily in. So if you look at our team, we've got maybe 10% of the team came from the industry, distribution, marketing, and so on. And then the remainder of the team came from really three places. We hired a lot of people from the video game industry, a lot of people from the media industry. And then the third, when you think about how do you get eyeballs, how do you get people in, a lot of people from the ad tech industry. And, it's sort of this approach of constantly A/B testing. A big focus of the platform is content. So, every week we're releasing what we call classes, which are deep dives into topics of interest around your health, your finances, life events. But the amount of content you have to produce to stay relevant and to not, the same type of stuff we're doing right now, but the amount of content you have to produce to stay relevant and stay on top of people's minds is really, really important.
It's overwhelming when you think of the bar to get somebody's eyeball, right? Average content's never been great, but now it's got to be something really good to get people to look and read and last their, stick on a page longer than a minute.
Yeah. It's funny. We, if you look at the evolution of how we approach it, we used to license content from third parties. We used to have a deal with a big university, Ivy League, that we did all our healthcare data from, or healthcare content from. We had another Kiplinger Wall Street Journal type thing for financial content. And, cool logos, really good content from an academic standpoint, but really dry, and, doesn't get people out of bed really. And about 2 years ago, we switched to creating all of our own content ourselves. Our head editor, she's brilliant, but she came from Refinery 29.
There you go. Yep.
Yeah, neat media platform. And this approach of really building content for the end consumer, making it fun. And then what we've tried to do, where the video game folks come into play, is to turn it into a sort of an immersive learning experience. So I might have a class that's content based. I see my avatar next to it in illustrations. After maybe 2 minutes of content, there's a quiz, then there's an activity. But it's funny now because when we were building it, I didn't have the context, but I see my kids who are in cyber school every day. And, you understand, like, most learning experiences are pretty dry and dull. So if you can create a really engaging, immersive learning experience, it goes a long way.
And that's where you have the avatar, and then you go one step farther, right? Like Snapchat did, and have Adidas build the tracksuit for the avatar to wear, or the Ralph Lauren, and tie it all back into branding. My Beagle likes that idea, I guess. But what's exciting you right now in the industry? We talked a lot about how a lot of people get chosen by insurance; they don't choose insurance. But what's exciting you right now?
Two broad themes. One is just how quickly the industry, or I'd say abruptly, not quickly, because it was slowly, and then all of a sudden, the industry has pivoted towards digital everything. But that's good. One of the other byproducts of COVID is everyone had to learn to make decisions quickly and take, measured risk in a more meaningful way. And I hope that persists. I hope we don't go back to a world of like incremental everything. That's one. The other is, you look at our industry, it feels like we've come a long way, but relative to some other, we've got self-driving cars, we've got, augmented reality, and well, I know you guys have done some stuff around virtual and augmented reality, but I mean, we're on the cutting edge of 5 to 10 years ago when it comes to the rest of the world. There's so much stuff that we could still be doing in this industry to modernize it. I mean, things like smart contracts, all that stuff gets really interesting.
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, speaking of that, so a lot of interest from startups, to do something, interesting in this industry. We get, we see a lot of great pitches and a lot of great ideas coming through our incubator. John, I get hammered with my inbox on a daily basis from, different, sort of vendors, pushing newer solutions to, some of the problems we have. If what advice would you give to startups today? Like, how do you cut through the clutter? My mailbox is filled. I'm getting, every time the phone goes off, I think it's going to be somebody calling me. And my kids are like, why are you answering that? I'm like, should not have done this. I don't need another car warranty. How do you, if you were to do this again, 2021, you're starting from scratch. I mean, what advice, what would you be doing? And, how would that translate to what other people should be doing if they've got great ideas they're trying to push across the line today?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have to sort of pause and think, but the level of noise, both in a good way and a bad way, has increased so much in the past, 7 or 8 years. Whereas before there was, the number of insurtech startups you could count on, your fingers and toes. Now, there's hundreds every week, it feels like, are being created. So the supply has increased dramatically, which can be overwhelming. Yet the demand and the ability to work with startups has also improved in a dramatic fashion too. So, supply and demand have both increased so much that I feel like to your point, having an approach and a strategy to cut through the noise is key. And, it's funny when I think back to where we started, our initial concept, we were selling into employers, and employers, the same thing happened. Basically the health tech wave seemed to precede the fintech wave by about 5 years. And, we were sort of early there. We're able to get meetings with all the right people. And then all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, employers will pay for stuff. And it was just like this feeding frenzy where, it looked like piranhas on, and all of a sudden you couldn't get meetings anymore because people are just getting flooded with invites and flooded with pitches. Having the right partners, frankly, it's sad to say, but having like the right founding team, the right advisory team is so critical, not just to having good ideas, but to being able to cut through some of that noise and get the right access to the right people and to have the credibility of, does this thing have staying power? Because, carriers, others you don't want to invest time in something that, may not be here in 3 months or 6 months. And yet the reason the thing may only be here for 3 to 6 months is because they couldn't get people to invest the time they needed. It's sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy that's hard to unwind. But getting the right group of advisors, I think, is really critical in an early stage business. Well, you're on the other side. What would you say?
Well, I actually had this question posed to me, actually, the one you're asking from, do you know Hannah Miller? She does a lot of writing for Life and Annuity News. And,
yeah.
What I told her, it was, you got to listen a lot, right? Because I see people that love the problem. They think it's a big problem. You tell them, maybe for somebody else, but it's not for us. And then they keep pitching the same solution. Now, sounds like you actually did listen, right? You had a pivot point where you said, here's what we're doing. It's too complicated, but we're going to listen to this company, right? Now that to me sounds like a seminal moment in your company.
It was interesting. I want to say we listened, but at the same time, we certainly read the tea leaves that the market we were in was not right. And we were hearing that through, like, it became hard to get meetings. It became like, how are you different then? And then they'd rattle off companies and like, oh my God. But then at the same time, when we came to this market, we were so early that if we had listened, people would have scared us off. And, and we were lucky to get the right investors and all that they had the staying power and the willingness to give us enough time for the market to develop and for us to develop the product. But if we had a shorter life expectancy, it could have been, too early.
Right.
Where, the market hadn't arrived yet, but we just got lucky in that regard.
No, I think the startups. You're right. There's that fine balance between listening, but listen. If you're a good startup, you've got an idea that's probably a year or two ahead of what everybody's talking about, right? So it's a little bit of listening, it's a little bit of pushing, and I think also to your point, and you've spent time building a team, then you actually have to deliver, because you get that, once you get an opportunity to work in these companies, and I tell you, it is hard, Jon, to go through get all the contracting people signed off, the legal, it's even smaller companies, it's hard.
Yeah.
So if I've invested time in a company, like, yours was 5 years ago, boy, I hope you're putting your heart and soul into this thing for me, because I've actually, even though it feels like I've got a paycheck, you know what? I've got a lot of line too. So I think delivery is a big part of the equation.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say, pardon Otis. I was going to say it's interesting because a lot of the conversations we have with individuals such as yourself with this, success following them, but it's an interesting story to how they got there. To me, I hear always it's a mixture of loyalty, trust, and technology. So it's not forgetting the human element. And I think that for at least the consumer side, speaking for myself, is a big deal, is if you can engage, retain me, and you put up with me asking you for cheaper prices every time I have to talk to you, with being able to tell your story and tell it well and keep people engaged in something that's monumentally important. So hopefully you are there for, 3 months plus 1 day and beyond.
Yeah.
I'll say, to that point, one of the most interesting and frankly, the most challenging things we've had to deal with is you're sort of dealing with two stakeholders. Actually, the carriers have the same issue. You're dealing with two stakeholders at the same time. Carriers, you've got the policyholder and you've got the advisor, and you're trying to make both happy and you're trying to balance the two. In our world, we've got the carrier who's our client and we've got the end consumer. And everyone wants the same thing, but sometimes the next feature you create, is it one that delights the carrier, is it one that delights the consumer? And getting those balances right and those trade-offs right is always something. I envy the businesses that just have one stakeholder they have to deal with.
Right. Hey, well, Jon, this was terrific to have you back. You were a tremendous panelist for our retirement event. Thanks for your time there. Thanks for your time today. Laura, any other last questions or thoughts for Jon?
Yes, if people are interested in learning more, as I'm sure Otis is here, what's the best way they can get in touch with you?
Yep, we make it easy. So life.io. You just go to that website and there's a lot of information there, and then we're easily accessible there. And Paul, Laura, thank you both for having us. This has been great. And I appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, great.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, listen, thank you. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Reimagine podcast. Tell your friends if you liked it, share it, and let us know if you've got people you think should be on and be part of our conversation. So anyway, thanks, Jon. Thanks, Laura.